Hi, I'm Nikki Lowe, and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show, where I share insights and interviews that support women to combine their family, work, and life in a more successful and sustainable way. Welcome to this episode, and I'm really excited to be joined by a guest that helped me with my own recovery from burnout. And when I discovered her book and started reading Rushing Woman Syndrome, I felt that she'd written it just for me, but also for countless other women who are running themselves into the ground, trying to keep up with their never-ending to-do list. I think it's fair to say that women are feeling wired but tired. So if you find yourself answering to the question when somebody asks how you are, either so busy or stressed, or if you can't sit down as you feel guilty, even if you're tired, or you feel overwhelmed and there just aren't enough hours in the day, and you find yourself overreacting easily, even if you don't show it to others, then this episode is for you. My guest is the amazing nutritional biochemist, Dr. Libby Weaver, PhD. Dr. Libby is a 13 times best-selling author, speaker, and founder of the food-based supplement range, BioBlends. And armed with abundance of knowledge, scientific research, and a true desire to help people regain their energy and vitality, Dr. Libby empowers and inspires people to take charge of their health and happiness through her books, live events, and online courses. Respected international speaker, Dr. Libby's expertise in nutritional biochemistry has led her to share the stage with names such as Marianne Williamson, Sir Richard Branson and Tony Robbins, as well as many female thought leaders. She's regularly called upon by television and radio as an authoritative figure in the health and wellness industry. With a natural ability to break down even the most complex of concepts into layman's terms, Dr. Libby's health messages embrace her unique three-pillared approach that explores the interplay between nutrition, emotions, and the biochemistry of the body. And it's no surprise that when it comes to achieving and maintaining ultimate health and well-being, Hollywood stars like Hugh Jackman and Deborah Lee Furness describe her as a one-stop shop in achieving and maintaining ultimate health and well-being. So I'm really honoured and privileged that Dr. Libby is joining us today, and I can't wait to share her wisdom with you. I think you're going to love how she shares about how our bodies work and what actually is going on in our modern world for us as women, and why we may be feeling symptoms of Rushing Women Syndrome and not really understand what's going on or what to do about it. But don't worry, in this episode, she shares it all with us, and I won't keep you any longer. Let's dive in and welcome Dr. Libby. So welcome, Dr. Libby. I'm so honoured that you've joined me here on the podcast show today.
Oh, Nikki, thank you so much for having me join you. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
As I've said in the introduction, your work has been kind of pivotal to my own recovery. And when I discovered it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so vital. And I know when I've mentioned it to so many of my clients, they can relate to. So the fact that we've got you on the show so we can share your message with even more women, I'm just incredibly grateful.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Nikki. And I always like to say to people, when we're often exposed to information and it might resonate for us, but it doesn't necessarily lead us to take action on it. And so I put the credit right back on you. If my work has made a difference for you, that's because you did it, you acted on it. So, because lots of people read things and they don't do anything about it, even though it might resonate. So I think it's all down to you, and good on you.
No, thank you. And it's work that I keep coming back to, actually, because I can find myself being dragged back into all of the busyness of modern life and then coping strategies that may not be helpful. And so it's work that I continually come back to. So it's not just that one-off, I read it and it had an impact. It continues to have an impact. And I'm sure we'll get into that in this conversation. So obviously today we're exploring the topic of your hugely successful book, Rushing Women Syndrome. Can you explain what Rushing Women Syndrome is for those that may not yet have discovered it and come across it?
So absolutely. So rushing woman syndrome is the name of a book that I wrote. It's not a medical condition, but it was the name I gave to a pattern of symptoms I was seeing in more and more of my female clients. And it's essentially what I've come to call sympathetic nervous system dominance, which is, and I'm sure we'll get into more of this, but in a nutshell, there is a part of our nervous system where the fight or flight response exists. That's the sympathetic nervous system. And then the opposite arm of that is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the calm arm of the nervous system. And where we experience really great levels of health when we can swing very easily between those two nervous systems being activated. The trouble comes with our health when we get it's almost like we get stuck with the sympathetic nervous system activated. And so many of the symptoms of what I came to call rushing woman syndrome stem from us living too much in that fight or flight response.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I used to say to people, kind of tongue in cheek, was my superpower is firing at my adrenal system. And kind of tongue in cheek in that actually it's not a superpower, because actually it was my undoing, but it just seemed so natural that I could do it. And when I read about, as you say, SND, it's like, oh, actually that's what's going on here. And it's, I've got to be really careful of it, because it can too easily get fired and I can get stuck there.
And it's just so common, Nikki. And we think, and so when you say it's our superpower, I think so many women relate to that, and we are incredibly capable. We're just so incredibly capable. It's just that what I really want people to appreciate is that we have never ever before asked our body to live like this. So if we have to look to human evolution to understand where we find ourselves today. So let's say, science suggests humans have been on the planet for about 150,000 years. And if we let that 150,000 years be represented by, let's say, a 1 kilometre walk, then the last 75 years and the way we've been living in what I call the commercial era, or the period of time since the end of World War II, if we look at how much has changed across the last 75 years with the introduction of pesticides to the food supply, if we look at the introduction of mobile phones, the internet, social media, all of that is so incredibly brand new to us. The last 75 years represents one very small step on a 1 kilometre walk. In other words, the way we now live is very, very brand new to our biochemistry, to our nervous system, to all of our hormonal systems. We've never before lived like this. And historically, when we made stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, it was because there was a genuine threat to our life. And so we would spike our stress hormone levels, but as soon as we'd fought the fight or escaped from the threat, our stress hormone levels went back to baseline. And it might have been 2 or 3 more weeks before we were threatened again and our stress hormone levels would spike. Whereas what happens now is we live with the constant and relentless production of stress hormones, because so much of what drives our stress hormone production now is psychological. Although your listeners probably want to block their ears with what I'm about to say. Caffeine leads us to produce adrenaline. Unfortunately, I wish that wasn't the case, but it does. And the other things that lead us to produce adrenaline these days are our perceptions of pressure and urgency, and quite often worrying about what other people think of us, even though we might not be conscious of that. And so because so much of our stress response today is psychological, when we're not without it, so the production of stress hormones now is constant and relentless for just so many people. And so that's what I mean, that we've never before lived like this. So although we are very, very capable, our body will let us know when it's not happy with our choices. And all the symptoms of rushing woman syndrome, I think, are one of the ways it gives us feedback that some things need to change. The body is our best friend. It really is. It's not here to betray us. It truly is an extraordinary feedback mechanism for us, always trying to guide us to homeostasis.
I think that's such a beautiful description. And it kind of reminds me of that analogy of a boiling frog, of actually this has crept up on our kind of culture and society to the point that we don't really notice it. But when you're taken out of it, we would probably think that how we're living is crazy. I was only having a conversation with my mother-in-law, who turns 80 this year, and she was kind of just reflecting on modern life and mothering in our modern world. And she was saying that, back in her day, obviously they didn't even have washing machines and didn't have cars. And she said, in some ways it was more difficult because of that. But she said in so many other ways it was easier. There wasn't the pressure and the pace that we now live in.
Exactly. And obviously there's sort of benefits and drawbacks to all of it, isn't there? And there are days when we focus on, all the drawbacks of being accessible because of our mobile phones, for example. We can be accessible 24/7 if we allow that. But we also can, and we can be focused on the drawbacks of that. But there are also benefits to that in that, people can reach us if there's an emergency. There's all sorts of benefits as well. But it's when we notice that we are, I guess, really struggling with I'm using being accessible 24/7 as the example. And if we're struggling with that, well, we also need to remember that we get to choose to not do that. We could put our phone on flight mode at 7:00 at night and not turn it back on again until 7:00 the next morning if we wanted to. But it's allowing ourselves to do that.
Absolutely. So I'm imagining people already listening, nodding along. But what kind of symptoms would someone have that presented with this rushing woman syndrome? What might be some of the indicators that my listeners could look out for or relate to?
Certainly one of the first things that happens is sleep is disrupted, and that's partly because adrenaline, because it says to the body that your life is in danger, it doesn't want you to sleep deeply or restoratively when you have high circulating levels of adrenaline. It wants to keep you ever so slightly awake so that you can get up and save yourself if you need to. So restorative sleep is compromised. And then that in itself has really big ripple effects. The next thing that will usually shift is the digestive system. So we notice that we get bloated very easily. We notice that we might have irregular bowel patterns. So we might have diarrhea sometimes, or we might be constipated at other times. We might notice that the digestion symptoms go more to the upper digestive system. So it might be more like reflux or heartburn. But bloating is a very, very common one. And certainly food can play a role in bloating, but the stress response does as well. And that's because normally we have a fantastic blood supply to the digestive system. However, when we have high circulating levels of adrenaline, because it's saying to our body that our life is in danger, the blood is diverted away from digestion to focus on supplying blood to the periphery, to the arms and the legs. And that's because we need a good blood supply in our arms and our legs to run away or fight the fight, because with good blood supply comes oxygen delivery, nutrient delivery, and we need all of that to be able to escape from the danger that our body is getting the message that we're in. So when the blood supply is diverted to the periphery, our digestion is then compromised. So digestive system complaints are very common. And then reproductive system challenges are also usually, they can become quite significant. And certainly there can be other things driving this, but living in what I have come to call rushing woman syndrome is one of the big drivers of some of these reproductive system challenges. And it might be that the periods become irregular, so you start to get your period far more often. So instead of, let's say, your cycle has always been 28 days, now you start to notice that you're getting it every 24 or 25 days, so it's shortened. Other women with a heightened stress response skip their period, so they might not ovulate and they don't actually get their period, so it becomes unpredictable. For others, it becomes very heavy and very painful. There can be clots in the menstrual blood, and they might experience flooding. There can be migraines or just headaches in the lead up to menstruation, fluid retention, changes in sleep patterns in the lead up to menstruation, and changes with our headspace, with our mood. So we can 1 minute feel really irritated and then the next minute feel like we could just fall apart with tears, either because we're super touched by something or just overwhelmed by things. So moods, I don't like to call them mood swings, but it's essentially what they are. I like to refer to as a shift in our headspace. Very, very common. So there's some of the really common symptoms. And the reason that that happens like that is because the parts of the body that govern all of that are all related. So in our brain, there's a region called the hypothalamus, and it is the ultimate control center for our endocrine system, for our hormonal system. And it's actually where our nervous system and our endocrine system meet. It meets in this region, in the hypothalamus in the brain. And the hypothalamus is forever asking the question, am I safe? And to assess whether we're safe or not, it looks out into the environment. So it's looking out at the availability of food. Is there a threat to our life? Is there oxygen in the atmosphere? So it's forever assessing our environment and asking, am I safe? And it also looks into our blood for information. So when the hypothalamus says, am I safe? And it looks into the blood and sees high circulating levels of adrenaline, it doesn't understand that adrenaline might be there because we've had a couple of coffees over the morning and we have 600 unopened emails and we have no idea when we're going to get the space to deal with them. It sees all that adrenaline and just thinks our life's in danger. So when it says, am I safe? The answer's no. So the hypothalamus then says to the pituitary gland, which is also in the brain, we're not safe. You need to communicate to everything else in the body that we're not safe. So the pituitary's job is to then talk to the thyroid gland, to the ovaries, to the adrenals, to the testes in men. So it speaks to all of the endocrine organs. The endocrine glands are the glands in the body that make all of our hormones. The pituitary then tells those glands, we're not safe, respond appropriately. So it might say to the ovaries, we're not safe, don't ovulate, because obviously the body links ovulation to bringing a baby into the world. And so it might say to the ovary, it's not safe to ovulate this month. And so if you don't ovulate, you don't get a lovely surge of progesterone. And progesterone, yes, it plays a role in reproduction, but it also has a lot of beautiful biological effects. It's a very powerful anti-anxiety agent. It's an antidepressant. It's a diuretic, so it allows you to get rid of excess fluid. So if the pituitary has said to the ovaries, don't ovulate this month, you then miss out on all the beautiful effects of the progesterone in the second stage of the menstrual cycle. So you feel far more anxious. You can go to a really low mood and your body feels really puffy and swollen, which can really distort some women's self-confidence, self-esteem, because they feel so uncomfortable in their clothes because everything feels tight. So that's a very common scenario. The pituitary might then say to the thyroid gland, we're not safe. So the adrenaline speeds everything up in the body. And so it speeds up heart rate, for example. Thyroid hormones also speed things up. They can speed up heart rate. They speed up just our general metabolic rate. So when we have high circulating levels of adrenaline long term, when the pituitary says to the thyroid, look, this person, she is living in overdrive. She has so much circulating adrenaline. Everything is running way too quickly on the inside. If I allow you, thyroid, to make more of your hormones, she's going to explode, and we can't risk that. We can't risk speeding her up even further. So you need to woo back. You need to produce fewer of your hormones. And so even though there's nothing wrong with the thyroid, you might then start to get symptoms of an underactive thyroid because the pituitary doesn't think it's appropriate to say to the thyroid, keep making a lot of hormones. And so again, another symptom that can start to come through when we've lived for too long with rushing woman syndrome is we won't have a thyroid disease necessarily, but we'll feel like we tick the box of all the symptoms of the thyroid not working properly. And so that's part of that mechanism. So everything is compromised when the hypothalamus says, am I safe? And the answer is no, because it sees that there's high circulating levels of stress hormones in the body. It then affects so many other body systems because they're all interconnected through that whole endocrine system.
Oh, Dr. Libby, I've never heard all of the interconnecting systems described so beautifully. That absolutely makes sense. And explains so much of kind of my own experience. And I'm imagining so many people listening can relate to that, because I remember thinking at one point that I was perimenopausal. I was like, I'm ticking all the boxes for perimenopause here, with the, as you said, kind of the mood changes, the reproductive kind of, my periods really shifted. And I was like, oh, it must mean that I'm there. And when I went and got myself tested, it wasn't. It was, my system had got completely out of balance, really, with what we're talking about here, rushing woman syndrome.
And it's almost, Nikki, I think it is just so incredibly common, and I think it's so important for us to support each other with this understanding. And it's almost like a good way to look at it is it's almost like what we call HPA axis dysfunction. So HPA axis is H for hypothalamus, P for pituitary, A for adrenal. That whole axis of communication is just in overdrive, and we have to find ways to communicate the truth to our body, which is that we are thankfully relatively safe. So we need to find ways for our body to understand that it's safe to do its magical, beautiful, very important work, and then we get to feel good.
Yeah, and your book is so brilliant because you devote kind of 5 chapters to hormone havoc. You then talk about digestive dilemmas, and you really dig deep into the science behind actually what's happening, as you say, in each of those systems with this. So I'm imagining that there's going to be so many people listening, nodding along, going, "Oh gosh, this I can really relate to at quite a profound level." And clearly, we've talked about like cultural and society wise, we're kind of living in this modern world that has kind of as you say, the last 75 years really changed. What are some of the things that we can do, that we could influence if we find ourselves kind of either tipping into rushing woman syndrome, or we find ourselves bang right in there and we're like, yeah, I think I'm totally in that space.
I'll touch on 2 things straight up, Nikki, that I think have a big difference, and they're sort of worlds apart from each other. And the first one is to become breath aware. And the reason I say that is because for most rushing women, we will breathe in the upper part of our chest, and we breathe very rapidly. The inhalation is longer than the exhalation. And when we breathe like that, we're communicating to our body that we're not safe. So we activate that sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight response. I often call it the red zone. And yet we can communicate the truth to our body if we slow that down. So if we breathe diaphragmatically, which means if we breathe in and out through our nostrils, and when we breathe in, when we inhale, our belly inflates, it pushes forward. And then with a lovely long, slow exhalation, again through our nostrils, the belly shrinks back towards our spine. When we breathe like that, we move our diaphragm. And when we do that, we communicate that we're safe to our body. And that's because we would never be able to breathe like that if our life was truly in danger. If there really was someone from another tribe having jumped out of the jungle at us in that moment, we're not going to go, oh, can you just hang on a minute? I just need to do my yoga breaths. Our life would be over if we did that. So we're supposed to go into that rapid breathing to save our own life. But when we're sitting at our desk or driving our car or in our garden, it's far more appropriate and it's far more truthful if we breathe diaphragmatically. That allows our body to experience that it's safe. And when the exhalation is longer than the inhalation, we actually activate the parasympathetic nervous system. We activate that lovely calm arm of the nervous system. So it really can help to set little rituals in your day to get you to get yourself to become breath aware. So if you work at a desk, at a computer, you'll be able to see the time. And so it might be every hour on the hour, you do 20 long, slow breaths and do the diaphragmatic breathing. Or you might decide that you're going to begin each day with even just 5 or 10 minutes of gazing out the window, noticing the sky and breathing really slowly, or 20 minutes at the end of the day before you go to sleep. Or it doesn't have to be long, but just little rituals across the day to check in with your own breathing and drop down into diaphragmatic breathing if you're not already doing that. So that's a very powerful way to reduce stress hormones, a very powerful way to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And then the other thing I would say, which this second one takes more work, but my goodness, is it worthwhile? And the second one is to explore what I call they're the traits you need other people to see in you. So what a really great exercise for all of us to do is to sit with pen and paper and say, how do I need other people to see me? And just be completely honest with yourself with your answers and write them down. And really common things rushing women have said to me over my working life is I need people to see me as kind, thoughtful, selfless. It might be hardworking, efficient, intelligent. Sometimes other things come out like playful. Perfect is very common. And then if you get that word, you need to dig into that. Okay, so what's perfect look like? What are the traits involved in perfect? You might need people to see you as the biggest ray of sunshine that ever walked into a room. So there's no right or wrong, but you want to understand how you need other people to see you. And then the next time you're stressed, which you may not reveal to other people, you might keep it all under wraps and you look like the graceful swan gliding across the surface, but really underneath you're paddling really quickly, like a little duck paddling really quickly to get upstream against the current. So you may never reveal your stress to others, but the next time you're stressed, just pause and consider, am I perceiving someone is seeing me in the opposite way to one of these traits? And most of the time the answer will be yes. So when we think about let's say running late. So running late stresses some people out, but not everyone. So that's how we know it's not a real stress. And it doesn't matter if someone finds it stressful or not. I'm going to use this as the example. So sure, what might stress someone out about running late is that they might be on their way to a concert and they don't want to miss the first act or the first song of the performance. But mostly if you dig into what is going to stress you out about running late, it's usually what the person who's going to be on the receiving end of your running late is going to think of you. So we are wired as human beings until we do this work, we are wired to seek the approval of others. And it comes from when we're born. Obviously, as little baby humans, human babies can't survive on our own. We need we need people or someone at least to care for us enough to give us food and clothing and shelter. And so our nervous system comes to recognize when we're very little that, we're hungry and that's very uncomfortable. And then a grown-up comes along and gives us something and it takes away that discomfort and we get back to homeostasis and we're comforted and calm and everything's back in balance on the inside. Or we might be cold and we make a noise and someone comes along and wraps us in a blanket and that takes that discomfort away. So we come to link the provision of these things for our survival. We start to work out that we need to maintain the favour of these grown-ups enough to ensure our survival. So in other words, we start to, not consciously, we're not aware that we're doing this, but we start to link the provision of these things to our survival. And so therefore we work out we must maintain their approval. And I don't mean this in a manipulative way. None of it's conscious, but we then try out all sorts of different ways to maintain or gain the approval of others. And it's a huge part of the way our personality develops. And we start to work out that when we are fill in the blank of one of your traits, when I'm kind or when I'm really thoughtful, my needs get met by that person. And so we then create a belief inside ourselves that that's how we have to be. So we have absolutely no flexibility quite often in how we can handle other people seeing us. And rushing women, or all humans, but especially rushing women, are really the part of the work that I love to talk about with women is we've got to develop flexibility in how we can handle other people seeing us, because we understand that when we look out upon the world, we're looking through filters, and what we don't hear what someone says, we hear what we think they meant. We all do that. So, for example, when a lot of us have been working from home recently, and so when a colleague rings you and says, "Where's that work? I needed it yesterday," yeah, we've heard their request for work, and that in and of itself is not stressful. what can make that request for work stressful is that you make up a story about how you think your colleague perceives you for not having already done that work. So we then, where the stress comes from is that we're worried that they're seeing us as inefficient or lazy or careless, or that we lack, that we're not thoughtful, or we're not grateful for our job, or in other words, we perceive some form of disapproval coming from the other person when they didn't ring us up and say, you're really bad at your job and you're so lazy, and they didn't say any of that. But we make up a story about how we think they perceive us, which is just a story. They probably just want the work because they want to progress what they've got to get done. And we do that all the time. So it's to start to retire from rushing woman syndrome. The two big things I think that make a difference is the breath work on a day-to-day basis and a moment-to-moment basis. We can apply that. And I also think it's so incredibly important to know how you need other people to see you and then develop flexibility with that.
Oh, those are so powerful, because there's a real practical thing that is accessible to us all the time and anywhere. And then there's something that's really psychologically profound there about, doing that inner work, understanding our subconscious reactions. And I think that's so relatable for me, and I think my community, in that I think a lot of the people in the Wisdom for Working Mums community would probably identify themselves as being kind of an overachiever. And with that comes that over-functioning, that you want to be seen to be competent and capable and there for everybody. And I could, as you were talking, and particularly about the time piece, I've always said the most difficult relationship I've ever had in my life is with time. And it's, and I, as you were talking, I was like, oh my gosh, that's a key way that I fire my adrenal system up, is looking at the clock, kind of thinking, oh my gosh, I've still got all this to do. And it's interesting. I've just had my office redone, and there's a space on my wall that I've seen this beautiful clock that I think would go with my decor. And I'm really having to resist buying it, because I'm like, having this big clock on the wall is not going to be healthy for me.
Oh, I hear you, Nikki.
But there's one of the things that also was on my mind was something that, as I said, I have to keep coming back to with your work, is often when I get caught up into the busyness of life, and all of my to-do list, I then start to make choices that undermine my health. So it might be that I work later into the evening, which means then the next day I'm tired. So then I want a cup of coffee, and then I notice that my blood sugar's dropped. So I then want sugar, and all of these compound things that in themselves are just small little choices. But when you add them together, and that really comes across in your book about actually what are some of the things that we're using as coping strategies that might actually be undermining some of this.
And it can be a vicious cycle, can't it? Just as you just alluded to. So when we don't sleep properly, yes, we want the coffee in the morning, and we warm ourselves up with the caffeine, and then we feel like we need sugar to get ourselves through the afternoon because our energy's crashed, because we've set ourselves up on a blood glucose roller coaster with the caffeine. And then a lot of people will then feel like they want alcohol to cool down, to relax in the evening. And it doesn't matter if we do that occasionally. When I say occasionally, a couple of times a year, but most people don't do that a couple of times a year. They live like it. And it's finding a way to one of those things needs to change. And quite often a commitment to sleep is one of the key things that will start to change the flow and effect of those things. Because as you say, when we think to ourselves, oh, I'll just stay up a bit longer and get a few more tasks done or get a few more emails done, the ripple effect then is often not worth it. And sometimes we have to say to ourselves or remind ourselves that it won't be worth it just to get those few extra emails done. And, it's nothing that can't wait until morning. So it's where our value system really comes into play. I think a really powerful thing to do is to know your own values. And when I say the word values, I don't mean ethical preferences. I mean, what does your life demonstrate that you value? Because people will say, in some of the work I've done, someone might be really living on a lot of takeaway food. They're not cooking much for themselves. And when we cook for ourselves, our nutrition is better. And so I'll say, it would be great if you could start to, you might do a bit of do a big cook up on a Sunday if you have a bit more space, and then you've got a couple of meals for the week ahead. And, you know, many people have said to me, oh, I don't have time to cook. And what I realized is that when someone says they don't have time for something, what they're really saying is that's just not a priority for me right now. And when we when we find ourselves saying, I don't have time for that, I think we need to be honest with ourselves and try on the truth, which is, well, I'm saying right now that's not a priority, and am I comfortable with that? And, you know, if you have an aging parent who is, you know, very unwell, or they might not be long for this earth, then cooking dinner is probably the last thing on your mind. You want to be by their side, holding their hand, making sure they're comfortable. You know, that's your priority. Whereas in your general life, if there's, you know, not something full on going on like that, then if you want to have great health, then we need to cook for ourselves more often than we get takeaway. And so it's understanding our values. And because we will prioritize what we value. And when we value our health, or, you know, and you can break that down, sleep obviously is a foundation for health. When we understand that that's one of our highest values, then that health is one of our highest values, then we can choose that over emails. Because why are we doing the emails? It's usually, sometimes it's because we want to tick it off our to-do list, but other times it's because we don't want the person who we're going to be writing to think that we're inefficient, or that we don't value them, or we don't care about them. So it's, again, quite often boils down to worrying about what someone thinks of us, and we need to care enough about ourselves to prioritize our own health more often than we don't.
Oh, it's just made me really emotional listening to you, Dr. Libby, because it's like you're looking into my life. It's interesting. I was laying in bed with my son last night, putting him to sleep, and I was saying, I've got to get up early in the morning. Mummy's going to have a really early night and for this interview. And I was telling him about what this interview is about. And it was really describing kind of why health is so important. And I lost my mum. My mum died in her late 50s, very suddenly, very unexpectedly. And that kind of left a deep imprint for me about how health is so important. And I was saying to my son, you know, I've got a lot of cancer in my family, both on my maternal and paternal side. So my why of health has become really, really important to me, about actually, as you say, knowing your values. Health is now, and I was saying to my son, you know, health is my top value, because I learned from my burnout experience, and obviously losing my mum and now both my parents, that actually health, if you've not got your health, it doesn't matter how much of anything else you've got, you can't enjoy life. You know, it doesn't matter how much money I've got, how big my house is, as you say, how many emails I've done, how other people perceive me. And so that why is so important. But often modern life can take me away from that. And I was talking to my son about kind of choices and about the choices that we make. And it's coming back to health. So I absolutely could hear that in you, as you spoke. And it made me also think about one of my mentors that I trained with about 10 years ago. I did a year-long training with him, and he just said in passing one day, he was like, being competent is really important. Being perceived as competent is really important to you, isn't it? And it was just this comment that came out of nowhere, and it really struck me. And A, because it was so perceptive, but B, I was like, oh gosh, what had he seen in me that meant that he could see that was so important? And it goes back to that piece about, you said about actually explore your traits, about how do you want people to perceive you? And I often get caught up between that needing to be seen to be competent and coming back to my values of, oh my God, if I haven't got my health, then nothing matters.
That's so insightful, Nikki. My gosh, that's brilliant. And it's just constantly having awareness of that, and more often choosing health, not worrying about that someone sees you as competent, because you are competent, just is what it is.
Yeah.
So it's knowing that.
And it's interesting because, you know, obviously we're talking about this in the context of rushing woman syndrome. I was interviewing a friend of mine who's an Olympic sports psychologist, and she just said in passing to me, statistics that I'd not heard before. And when I heard her say it, I was like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. And she was saying that the research now shows that girls between the age of 8 and 15, their confidence drops by about 30% compared to their male counterparts of the same age. And it then continues throughout their life, that kind of girls have or women have this kind of less confidence. And she was saying that the reason for that, they believe, is that women and girls, we are dependent. We work from an interdependence perspective. So you go back to, as you say, those cavemen days, that actually we were required to be able to work more as a community. We would want to be able to read the signals of our male counterparts where they came out from hunting, and pick up whether it had been a good day or a bad day. How do we create a happy, safe environment? And so we're constantly bidding for this interdependence about how do people perceive me, whereas boys and men tend to be more about independence, that, I can go for a goal and that's what defines my self-worth and self-esteem. So it just made me think in the context of that as well, about actually this is something that as women we probably have to focus more on, about that exploring our subconscious reactions.
I agree so much, Nikki. And I wrote a piece a while back called "Where Have All the Little Leaders Gone?" And it was out of a conversation I had with a colleague, and she had 2 boys, and she said, I used to, when they were in kindergarten and I'd go to the Easter hat parade, she said the little boys, as adorable as they were, she said they were just, all over the place, and their shirts are untucked and they're just, don't know where to walk. And she was generalizing, and she said, but the little girls, they've just got life, they're 5 years old and they've just got life sorted. And she said, and you can see all the future leaders of the country. And she said, but then I started to notice, once the kids were about 12, 13 and I'm going back to school, she said, I started to think, what's happened to the girls? Their posture has altered. Some of the light's gone out of their eyes. And again, it's a generalization, but it's, and so much of it, in some of the focus groups I've run with people, girls aged 18 to 25, when I asked them to name their biggest stresses, what commonly came out of that 18 to 25-year-old group was their body image and social media. So what people thought of their appearance and social media. And then when I would share that with some of the older focus groups, they would sometimes, you could see them either roll their eyes or laugh when I said that about social media, because they're like, how on earth could social media be stressful? And that's because the older groups were using social media to keep in touch with families or to watch funny dog videos. And so it leads me to, I guess, another concept for us to consider, is that what stresses us out can actually be one of the ways that we learn, that one of the modalities we're allowing people to judge us through. So, for example, the reason the younger groups found social media stressful is because they were focusing on the approval of others. They were wanting to get positive comments, people to like what they'd posted. So their focus, that's why they were sharing things, was for approval, essentially. Whereas the older groups, let's say one of the things that would stress them out, I touched on it earlier, was running late. That didn't feature for the younger people because it hadn't yet become a thing that they were allowing others to judge them through. So our stress doesn't have to be our enemy. It can be an extraordinary mechanism of feedback for us to learn about some of our inner processes that are otherwise quite hidden from our view, because so many of our responses are unconscious, and our stress can actually bring some of them into our awareness. And once they're in our awareness, we can do something about it. And I agree with you, we must address what on earth is happening to our young girls. As your colleague shared with you, between 18 and 15, that's just a dire statistic. And I completely concur. It's what I see too. So and it's very concerning, and it doesn't need to be that way.
Oh, I'm definitely going to dig out that article you've written. So where have all the little leaders gone? And when I find it, I'll put it into the show notes. So thank you for that. There is so much goodness that you've shared, Dr. Libby. Thank you. If there was just one thing that you hope that somebody's listening to this takes away, what would that be?
To let ourselves have what we already have, And that's because I think as rushing women, we are often so focused on the future. We can be very focused on achievement. And yet if you talk to someone who's dying and you ask them what they're going to miss the most, they tell you the most ordinary things, and they'll tell you that they're going to miss their partner's face, or the feeling of their dog's fur under their fingertips, or the night sky. And we have all of that right now. So I think we need to let ourselves have what we already have, because I think that's what joy is all about. And joy gives us an irreplaceable depth of energy. And energy is something that rushing women sometimes have a lot of, and something that crashes at times. And I think to be present and to allow ourselves have what we already have is an incredible gift we can give ourselves.
Oh my gosh, that's incredibly beautiful. That's really, I can really feel that in my heart. So thank you. And I know that people are going to want to find out more about you and your work. So could you point us in the right direction of where's best to kind of follow you or connect with you?
Oh, thanks, Nikki. Yes, my website is drlibby.com, so drlibby.com. My Instagram thing is the same, so drlibby. And Facebook, I think, is Facebook is Dr Libby Live. So there's things are shared there, not quite every day, but most days. But drlibby.com, the website, is where all the information is about my books and my online courses and what I'm up to.
Because you do the 28-day reset, don't you?
Yeah, so I have a couple of online courses. One of them is Detox by Dr Libby, which is sort of the truth about detox, and it explains all the different mechanisms that are going on inside of us that allow the body to do its critical detoxification work. And yes, it's a 28-day course that I take people through, and that starts on the first Monday of every month. And I have some new things coming out a bit later in the year. One of them related to rushing women syndrome. So
I'll keep an eye out for that then.
Yeah, it just is something that just resonates for so many women, and it's a big thing for me to help women to not live like that. And so I hope that is also helpful.
Absolutely, and I'll also put a link to your books in the show notes as well, because I've referenced rushing woman syndrome, but that's just one of many books that you've written, and all of them are really powerful. So I know you've got the whole kind of list of those on your website. So I'll put a link to that as well.
Thanks, Nikki, so much.
Really loved our conversation. So thank you for joining me all the way from Australia. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a joy to speak to you. Thank you so much for your beautiful questions, Nikki, and for your tender heart. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, please share it on social media and with your friends and family. I'd love to connect with you too. So if you head over to wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk, you'll find a link on how to do this. And if you love the show and really want to support it, please go to iTunes, write a review and subscribe. You'll be helping another working mum find this resource too. Thanks so much for listening.